Hi, crime enthusiasts. This is your host Ashita, and the story I have for you today is that of Annie Börjesson in Scotland. Nearly 20 years ago, on December 4th, 2005, 30-year-old Annie Börjesson was found face down on Prestwick Beach in Ayrshire. A dog walker made the grim discovery early that morning, just a mile from the airport where Annie had been due to catch a flight home to Sweden the day before. But she never boarded that plane. Less than 24 hours later, her body washed up on the cold Scottish shore. Scottish authorities quickly ruled her death as a suicide, but her family and many who have examined the case believe otherwise. Annie was a bright, ambitious woman, a talented linguistic, and a singer with a life full of promise. Why would she suddenly decide to end it all? And if she had, why were there so many unsettling details left unexplained? The missing CCTV footage, the unclaimed suitcase, the bruises on her body. None of it fit the official narrative. Was Annie's death truly a suicide? Or was she silenced by something far more sinister? What happened in those lost hours between the airport and the beach? And could the answers still be buried after all these years? Annie Börjesson was often described as a woman of remarkable talent and energy. She was fluent in 6 languages, a gifted singer with a beautiful voice, and someone whose presence could instantly light up a room. Her friends knew her as outgoing, confident, and full of life. One of her closest friends, Maria Jansen, fondly recalled, "She was independent, she was strong, with her long, thick blonde hair. She was like a Viking princess." It was a fitting description for a woman who carried herself with a quiet strength and fierce determination. When Annie moved to Edinburgh, she was eager to embrace new experiences. She enrolled in English courses to refine her language skills and eventually found work at a well-known tourist hotspot in the city. She had a passion for learning and meeting new people, and those around her admired her adventurous spirit. Despite being far from home, Annie maintained close connections with her family and friends in Sweden. She would frequently call and update them on her life, sharing stories of her time in Scotland and making plans for the future. As December 2005 approached, Annie was looking forward to returning to Sweden for a visit over Christmas. She had spoken to her loved ones about her plans, expressing excitement about seeing her family again. There was nothing to suggest that she was struggling or that anything was wrong. To those who knew her best, Annie was a young woman filled with hope and ambition, someone who was not only building a life abroad but also planning for the future. Yet, within days, everything would change. Instead of reuniting with her family for the holidays, Annie's life would come to a tragic and mysterious end on a cold windswept beach in Scotland. In the days leading up to her death, Annie Börjesson showed every sign that she was planning for the future. She had paid an advance on the rent for her flat in Edinburgh, suggesting she intended to return after the holidays. She had also booked an appointment with the hairdresser back in Sweden for a date between Christmas and New Year, hardly the actions of someone who was contemplating ending her life. To those who knew her, these were normal, everyday choices that reflect stability and routine, reinforcing the belief that she had every intention of returning home for the holidays and coming back to Scotland afterward. On the afternoon of December 3rd, 2005, the day before her body was discovered, CCTV cameras at Prestwick Airport captured Annie arriving at approximately 3:14 p.m. Dressed in a dark coat, she appeared calm, walking into the terminal with a purposeful stride. It looked as though she was ready to board her flight home to Sweden. But then, something strange happened. Just 5 minutes after entering the airport, the same camera recorded Annie walking back out through the same door she had just come in. She wasn't checking in for a flight, nor did she appear to interact with staff or other passengers. There was no sign of distress or hesitation, just an unexplained departure from the terminal. From there, she vanished. For the next several hours, Annie's whereabouts remained unknown. No further confirmed sightings were reported. No calls to family or friends indicated that anything was amiss. It was as if she had simply disappeared into the cold Scottish evening. The next morning, on December 4th, 2005, a dog walker made a grim discovery on Prestwick Beach, just over a mile from the airport. There, lying down in the sand, was Annie Börjesson. Her body had washed up along the shoreline, her long blonde hair tangled with the seaweed. She had no obvious external injuries that would suggest a violent struggle, but the scene left more questions than answers. Scottish authorities quickly ruled out foul play, suggesting that Annie's death was either an accident or a suicide. They theorized that she had walked to the beach after leaving the airport, entered the water voluntarily, and drowned. But her family and friends were never convinced by this explanation. The inconsistencies only deepened the mystery, leaving those close to Annie searching for answers to this day remain elusive. Within just 100 minutes of her body being discovered on Prestwick Beach, Annie Börjesson was moved to a mortuary, a decision that, to many, seemed unusually hasty. Detective Michael Neal, who was on duty that morning, later defended the speed of this action, stating that it was a race against time due to the incoming tide. Authorities feared that crucial evidence might be lost if water reached her body, so they acted quickly. However, forensic experts have questioned whether the urgency of this decision may have come at a significant cost. Dr. Kerry Nixon, a consultant forensic psychologist, has since expressed doubts that a thorough forensic investigation took place. It seems unlikely that everything that needed to be done was done forensically, she remarked, pointing out that the rapid removal of a body from a potential crime scene can often result in a critical evidence being lost or overlooked. According to these concerns, official records later revealed an unsettling timeline. A document dated December 5, 2005, just one day after Annie's body was found, shows that Scottish authorities had already communicated to their Swedish counterparts that they had suspected her death was a suicide. This conclusion had reached before any forensic examination had been carried out. In fact, Annie's post-mortem wasn't conducted until December 7th, 3 days after her body was discovered. When the autopsy was finally performed at our hospital, the findings were brief and to some, suspiciously inconclusive. The report stated that Annie had suffered no significant injuries or evidence of trauma. The official cause of death was recorded as drowning, with no mention of any foul play or struggle. From that perspective of law enforcement, this finding reinforced their initial assumption that Annie had walked into the sea on her own accord. However, when Annie's body was eventually repatriated to Sweden, disturbing contradictions began to emerge. Gunn Daneberg, a highly experienced Swedish funeral director with nearly 4 decades in the industry, was one of the first to see Annie's body upon its return. What she observed shocked her. "I have never experienced anything like this before. You don't forget," she later recalled, still haunted by what she saw. "I think the family was in a state of shock. She couldn't have caused all those bruises herself." What Danberg found was alarming: visible finger marks around Annie's neck, two distinct impressions that stood out clearly against her pale skin. These markings were completely absent from the Scottish autopsy report. "I still remember them so clearly," she said. Two marks on her neck, almost like someone had been gripping her. But that wasn't all. As she continued her examination, she noticed extensive bruising on Annie's body. The discoloration, dark and severe, suggested that she had multiple blunt force injuries before her death. These bruises, which appeared to be the result of a violent struggle or repeated impact, had not been documented in the Scottish post-mortem report. If Annie had drowned without interference, as authorities claimed, how could these injuries be explained? And then there was Annie's hair. Friends and family knew her for long, thick, blonde locks, her Viking princess hair, as some affectionately called it. She had been seen with her long hair in the CCTV footage captured just hours before her death. But when her body arrived in Sweden, her hair was noticeably shorter, roughly cut as though someone had taken scissors to it in a hurry. Even more disturbing, there was a bald patch on her head, an area where hair had been forcefully pulled out. To those who saw it, it looked as if someone had grabbed a fistful of her hair and yanked it with brutal force. The troubling inconsistencies didn't end there. An undertaker in London, who had handled Annie's body during its journey from Scotland to Sweden, also noted peculiarities that raised red flags. Upon arrival in Sweden, yet another undertaker confirmed the same findings: bruising, strangulation-like marks, the missing hair, none of which were mentioned in the Scottish forensic report. These professionals with decades of experience in handling bodies were adamant that something was not right. Yet, despite these alarming discoveries, Scottish authorities refused to budge from their initial conclusion. Detective Michael Neal remained firm in his stance. There was never anything at all in the whole investigation to indicate that there was any criminality involved in Annie's death. The inconsistencies were too glaring, the unanswered questions too many. Desperate for clarity, they formally requested access to the photographs taken during Annie's post-mortem examination in Scotland. If they could see the images for themselves, they reasoned, they might be able to compare them to the condition of her body when it arrived in Sweden. Their request was denied. Authorities refused to release the images, citing a lack of strong enough public interest to justify their release. They also claimed that the photographs would be too distressing for the family to see it. But to Annie's loved ones, this refusal felt like yet another obstacle, another attempt to keep the truth buried. If there was nothing to hide, why refuse to share the evidence? These questions would haunt her family and friends for years to come. And with every new discovery, one unsettling possibility became harder to ignore: that Annie Börjesson's death was not a tragic accident, nor was it a suicide. It was something else entirely, something far more sinister. Annie Börjesson had finished her contract at work, but that didn't stop her from visiting her old colleagues. She had made good friends during her time in Edinburgh, and one of those friends was Kat, a co-worker who would unknowingly become one of the last person to see Annie alive. On Friday, December 2nd, 2005, Just a day before she was found dead on Prestwick Beach, Annie stopped by to catch up with Kat. It was a casual visit, nothing out of the ordinary. At one point, Annie excused herself to make a phone call. Nothing about her demeanor seemed concerning or out of character. If anything, she appeared cheerful. Kat later recalled, "She was in a good mood. She didn't seem depressed at all." It doesn't add up. Annie's best friend, Maria Hansen, echoed the same sentiment. She had been eagerly anticipating Annie's visit to Sweden for the holidays, and the two already had made plans for Annie to stay at her house. She had great plans, Maria insisted. She was going to come home to Sweden to visit me and stay at my house for a couple of days. There was no indication that Annie was struggling, no hint that she was in distress, and certainly nothing to suggest she was considering taking her own life. For those closest to Annie, the official ruling of suicide never made sense. Her family, upon seeing her body, grew even more convinced that something sinister had happened. They took photographs of her bruising, believing the evidence spoke for itself. Annie had been beaten, drowned, and then deliberately placed on the beach to make her death appear self-inflicted. Hazel, another friend of Annie's, found it difficult that she would have chosen Prestwick Beach as a location to end her life. It was nearly 80 miles away from her home in Edinburgh, a journey that would have required her to take a train or bus specifically to that location. And even if she had, the beach itself posed another question. Why choose a bay where the water was so shallow that a person would have to walk nearly half a mile out just to reach a depth where they could no longer stand? The logistics of it seemed improbable. Yet, retired detective Michael Neal remained firm in his belief that there was no foul play. In his view, Annie's death was a tragic suicide, and he sympathized with the fact that families often struggle to accept such realities. A lot of families can't accept their loved one has taken their own life, he stated. There was never anything at all in the whole investigation to indicate that there was criminality involved in Annie's death. But as the details of Annie's final weeks came into sharper focus, her friends and family became increasingly convinced that someone else had a role in her death. In the days leading up to her passing, Annie had confided in her loved ones about an unsettling encounter with a man she had met at a nightclub. He had introduced himself as Martin Leslie, claiming to be the former Scotland international rugby player. Annie, an outgoing and sociable woman, took his words at face value, until she later discovered that the real Martin Leslie had long since returned to New Zealand. The man she had spoken to was an impostor. Even more disturbing was Annie's growing discomfort with him. She had described him as being very full-on, intense, persistent, and aggressive in a way that unsettled her. She told her family that his behavior made her feel uneasy, and soon afterward, she decided she wanted nothing more to do with him. But then, just days before his death, the mysterious man reappeared, this time at her local swimming pool. His presence felt anything but coincidental. Annie was deeply disturbed by it so much that she confided in her family about her fear. She believed he was a sexual predator, and she was determined to cut off all contact. Yet, despite this chilling lead, the man who called himself Martin Leslie was never identified. He was never questioned, never tracked down, and never connected to Annie's death. To those who knew Annie best, this was more than just an eerie coincidence. It was a potential link to something far darker, a missing piece of a puzzle that authorities had dismissed far too quickly. Another troubling mystery in Annie's case revolves around her phone records. Officially, police claimed that Annie had received no calls in the 3 days leading up to her death, an assertion that immediately raised suspicions among her family and friends. Annie's mother, Gue, knew this was untrue. She had called her daughter on December 1st, just 2 days before Annie's body was discovered. She was worried about Annie's well-being, though the precise nature of her concerns has never been made entirely clear. Annie answered the call. A friend of Annie's from Scotland later insisted that the conversation did happen, as she had been in the room at the same time. She distinctly remembered Annie telling her mother, "You have to respect this. I have to take care of myself." If Annie had received that call, why did the police claim otherwise? Had records been erased? And if so, by whom and for what reason? Annie's full name was Annie Christina Börjesson. Unbeknownst to many, she shared that middle name with another Christina Börjesson, an Emmy Award-winning American investigative journalist who had made a name for herself by exposing corruption within intelligence agencies. Christina Börjesson had been a relentless force digging into the murky dealings of the CIA and US government. She had been described as a thorn in the side of the intelligence community. Her investigations had cost her high-profile jobs, and many believed that she may have blacklisted by powerful figures in Washington. Could it be possible that Annie had been targeted in a tragic case of mistaken identity? At the time of Annie's death, the so-called war on terror was at its height. Reports later surfaced that Prestwick Airport, just a mile from where Annie's body was discovered, was being used as a stopover point for CIA rendition flights. These covert operations involved transporting terrorist suspects to secret prisons, such as Guantanamo Bay, often bypassing legal procedures and international scrutiny. Robert Mullum, a journalist investigating Annie's case, noted that these flights were an open secret at that time. He also pointed out that Christina Börjesson, the American journalist, had been an outspoken critic of these very operations. Could intelligence agents working in secrecy have made a fatal error? Then, another revelation surfaced, one that cast an even darker shadow over the case. Mulhan requested access to official correspondence between the Scottish and Swedish governments regarding Annie's death. He was denied. The reason? Releasing such materials could harm their relations with a foreign state. That foreign state was never explicitly named. Given the context, given the CIA flight operations, given the possibly mistaken identity theory, the implication was clear. Even more disturbingly, the Swedish government had classified Annie's case as a state secret. Mulhan was stunned. Classified documents in relation to a straightforward drowning? That doesn't add up. Why mark them top secret? He continued, "If you have nothing to hide here, then show us everything you have." And then there was one final chilling detail. Just 2 days before her death, Annie had made a call from a payphone to her family in Sweden. In that conversation, she confided in them that she feared someone was listening to her mobile phone calls. Was it paranoia? Or Annie had realized, too late, that she was being watched? While Annie's friends from Sweden described her as cheerful, lively young woman with a passion for singing, accounts from those who lived with her in Scotland painted a more complex and contrasting picture. Some of her flatmates recalled that Annie had seemed deeply lonely and struggled with feelings of isolation. One claimed that she had difficulty securing a stable job, which left her feeling discouraged and disheartened. Another flatmate admitted that she had eventually moved out because living with Annie had become overwhelming, describing her as pushy and intense. The strain in their living arrangements suggested that Annie's time in Scotland has not been as easy or fulfilling as she may have led her loved ones back home to believe. One particularly puzzling statement came from another flatmate, who recalled a cryptic conversation with Annie just 3 days before her death. Annie had told her that she had made a decision that would change her life. What exactly that decision was, or what she had meant by it, remains a mystery. To police investigators, this statement suggested that Annie had been struggling with mental health issues and that her life in Scotland may not have been as bright and happy as her friends and family in Sweden perceived. Despite these claims, many of Annie's closest friends strongly rejected the idea that she had taken her own life. They acknowledged that she had moments of anxiety in the days leading up to her death, but they insisted that she had been making future plans, including returning home for Christmas. Someone contemplating ending their life, they argued, would not go to such lengths to plan a trip home, book a hair appointment, or discuss plans for the future. However, law enforcement officials remained steadfast in their conclusion there had been no foul play. Yet, the conflicting perspectives on Annie's mental state, combined with the truly peculiar details surrounding her final days, left many unanswered questions. Was Annie truly struggling in silence, as her flatmates seemed to suggest, or was there something more to her death that have been overlooked? After analyzing all the evidence presented in the BBC documentary, I find myself left with even more questions and theories surrounding Annie Börjesson's death. There's no doubt in my mind that something about this case simply doesn't add up. While the official ruling leans towards suicide, I remain unconvinced. The inconsistencies, unexplored leads, and questionable investigative decisions suggest that Annie may have been the victim of foul play. One of the most striking red flags for me was mentioned almost in passing towards the end of the documentary. A witness, a shopkeeper, claimed that Annie used to come to his store and talk to him for hours. This seemingly minor detail set off alarm bells in my mind. Who was this shopkeeper? Did the police ever fully investigate this claim? Was Annie confiding in him something about something troubling? If she was feeling paranoid or unsafe, could she have been seeking comfort in small, everyday conversations with someone familiar? It's details like this ones that are casually mentioned and not followed up on that makes me question whether key aspects of this case were overlooked. Another issue that stands out to me is the financial aspect. Annie had no money on her phone, which could explain why she made calls from payphones. But why was she in Prestwick in the first place? Some speculate she might have been hoping to catch a last-minute flight home. But if she didn't have a ticket and wasn't financially prepared for such a trip, what was she doing there? Did she arrange to meet someone? Was she lured there under false pretenses? These are critical questions that remain unanswered. The mystery deepens with the surveillance footage, or lack thereof. The police dismissed blurry images as inadmissible, yet the odds of another person at that exact time and location wearing the same colored jeans, carrying a bag, and walking toward the water with someone else seem incredibly low. Likewise, the presence of a figure at the water's edge raises suspicions. If this wasn't Annie, then who was it? And if it was her, what exactly happened next? Some argue that the logistics of a potential murder make it implausible. The alternative theory that a killer somehow evaded CCTV, drowned Annie in fresh water, transported her body to the beach, and staged it as a suicide does sound elaborate. But does that mean it's impossible? Not necessarily. Criminals have successfully disposed of bodies in seemingly impossible ways before. Just because we don't have all the answers doesn't mean foul play should be entirely ruled out. The autopsy findings are another point of contention. While there were marks noted on her body, they were not classified as bruises, leading authorities to dismiss them as insignificant. But in my opinion, this doesn't necessarily prove anything. Could they have been the result of a struggle? Or were they caused by natural elements in the water? Again, too many questions and not enough clarity. Perhaps one of the biggest concerns I have is the secrecy surrounding this case. The refusal to release correspondence between Scottish and Swedish governments, the classification of Annie's death as a state secret, and the implication that disclosing information could damage relations with a foreign nation all raise serious suspicions. If this was simply an open and shut case of suicide, why the secrecy? What is there to hide? Transparency would clear up any doubts, yet authorities seem to determine to keep certain aspects of the case under wraps. I also have mixed feelings about the way law enforcement handle media inquiries. The journalist investigating Annie's case mentioned that 10 officers declined to speak, which was framed as suspicious. However, it's important to note that serving officers wouldn't be able to discuss an ongoing or past investigation without permission. The fact that two retired officers did agree to speak suggests they had nothing to hide. But does this mean the case was handled flawlessly? I don't think so. To me, this case is less about an elaborate conspiracy and more about perception. The authorities' unwillingness to acknowledge gaps in the investigation has only fueled public skepticism. Whether intentional or not, their reluctance to revisit the case makes them appear dismissive, which in turn makes people question whether they did their due diligence in the first place. At the heart of it all is Annie, a strong, independent woman described as a Viking by those who knew her. If she had fought for her life, surely there would have been more evidence of a struggle. But the absence of such evidence automatically ruled out foul play. I don't think so. Ultimately, this case remains an enigma. While the official story suggests suicide, I believe too many inconsistencies exist to accept that conclusion without question. Ultimately, this case remains an enigma. While the official story suggests suicide, I believe too many inconsistencies exist to accept that conclusion without a question. Until authorities agree to take a fresh look at the evidence, doubts will persist. I hope one day Annie's family gets the answers they deserve. Thank you for joining me today. Don't forget to subscribe to my podcast on Spotify and YouTube so you never miss an update. I appreciate you joining me today. Have an amazing weekend ahead. Until then, stay safe, crime enthusiasts.